on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And joining us once again is Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, as you know, is an economist, a writer, an author, and the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV every Tuesday night. He is also the author of a new book, a collection of essays around a theme. It's called The Sickness is the System When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. So, first of all, Richard Wolff, as always, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And by the way, congratulations as a writer on what I consider to be an excellent title, The Sickness is the System. And I guess I will start the way I often start with authors when they have a new book, which is what was the inspiration for creating it, for writing it?
Well, in a way, it was everything that's been going on. My life has become one in which I do two, three, sometimes more radio or television interviews almost every day. And so, of course, like everybody in this country, I have been caught up in all of the anguish and anxiety and uncertainty, both of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the economic crash. The only honest way of describing what we are going through, either of those things would have been a social crisis. Having the two together is, social crisis squared. And this book is an attempt to put it in perspective. And the title, which we anguished over, I can tell you, is meant to say to people, look, however horrible the sickness of COVID-19 surely is, the bigger sickness, the more profound sickness that we have to deal with is the economic system that failed so badly in preparing for this virus, in containing this virus, and in being so unstable that every 4 to 7 years it crashes. We're in the third crash of this new century. The dot-com one in the early 2000, the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and now this crash. I mean, this is a system that is so unstable that even if we weren't talking about the failure to prepare or the failure to contain the virus, we'd still be talking about an economic crash throwing millions of people's lives into turmoil and difficulty and so on. And my book is an attempt to understand it.
One of the things that occurred to me in listening to you describe the premise of the book was, of all things, a quote from Werner Herzog, the German film director, who said once that people are like minerals. They reveal their true nature under pressure. And if you accept that that can also be true about economies, about societies, then I would argue that what you're saying here, or suggest that what you're saying here, is that what we're seeing under the pressure of the pandemic is our society and our economy, our social order, as it always is, just being highlighted or accented by the extreme nature of what we're going through now. Is that fair?
Yes, I think so. And for me, the biggest question is, will we learn the lesson? Will this moment, when things are laid bare in the way you've just summarized, enable us to see what seems so murky and hard to see in quote unquote normal times? And let me give you a very simple illustration, which is developed at much greater length in the book. People ask, why is a country as rich as the United States in such a situation? A country with as highly developed a medical system as we do indeed have in this country, the United States. What in the world would explain that a rich country with a well-developed healthcare system has to admit to the following statistic? We have 4.5% of the world's people and we have 25% of the world's COVID cases and COVID deaths. I mean, there's no way around that. There's nothing to be said other than to have a gasp, an intake of breath, and then a slow exhale as you try to take in the enormity of an economic system that had the capacity, still has the capacity, to produce millions of masks and gloves and ventilators and hospital beds, but didn't do it. That has the capacity to stockpile them all over the country in warehouses, but it didn't do it. This is a system that failed. But when you look at the failure, that's when the system is suddenly kind of nakedly revealed. Here's what I mean. If you talk to a company that could have made masks, we have those companies here in the United States, they will explain to you, we didn't make masks, not because we're unaware that there are viruses that need masks. We are a mask maker. We know very well what causes the demand for masks. And we are equipped to make them, and we know how to preserve them. When you make a mask and you're not going to use it right away, you have to put it in a warehouse. You have to make sure that the temperature and the humidity of the warehouse are decent. You have to monitor the warehouse to see if the materials deteriorate, and if they do, you replace them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an enormous operation which we know exactly how to do. But here's the problem, they will explain to you. We are a profit-making capitalist enterprise. We do what's profitable. And you know something? To produce these masks and to warehouse them and to stockpile them and to maintain and monitor them, that's a lot of money. That's very expensive. And when will they be used? And the answer is nobody knows. It depends upon the vagaries of when the next virus is going to bother us. Could be 5 minutes, could be 50 years. That's too much risk. We're not going to invest our money in producing something under these conditions of expensive cost and risky time before we can sell them. So they didn't do it. And look, there's no other way to say that than what I'm about to say. The profit-driven capitalist system chose not, for the logic of profit, to produce the masks that our public health requires. Conclusion. Capitalism is not the way to organize for public health. And since one of the most fundamental criteria of an effective economic system has to be that it contributes to protecting the public health, capitalism failed. And we all know this. I mean, I'm just spelling it out, but everybody understands this. And everybody knows what might have happened. The government might have stepped in, and then it might have said what I just said, namely, private capitalism really stinks at maintaining public health, so we, the government, are going to come in and compensate for the failure of private capitalists to do what the public health requires. So here's what we will do in the government. We will go to the mask maker, for example, but we'll do it with all of them, and we'll say, we, the government, will buy the masks as fast as they come off your assembly line. We'll buy them, and then we'll use taxpayer money to take all the risk away from you because we're buying them as fast as you're producing them. You don't have to worry about whether and when a virus will come. We'll worry. The government will take the masks. The government will stockpile them in warehouses located across the country, proportional to the density of the population. We'll monitor them, we'll clean them, we'll replace them, we'll do it all. That way, the public health is protected, even though the private capitalists, left to their own devices, would not have done it. And how do I know that the government could have done that? And here's the thing I love to do in the book. I use the example that the government is already doing what I've just said. So, of course, they know how to do it. You know where they do it? Military. It turns out that just like it isn't profitable to produce masks and store them indefinitely in warehouses, the same is true with machine guns or guided missiles or tanks or military equipment of all kinds. The private capitalist says it's very expensive to produce a tank. And then what am I supposed to do with it? You want me to store it in a warehouse and check that it is in good shape and oil it properly and repair it if it breaks down? What are you talking about? This, and then for what? A war that may not come for 10 years? I'm not doing that. That's not a profitable investment for a capitalist. And the way we handle that in the United States is that the government comes in, buys the tanks, buys the missiles as fast as they come off the assembly line, and then at our expense, we, the taxpayer, the government stores, stockpiles, monitors, and maintains military equipment. So here's the bottom line. What U.S. capitalism did for military preparedness, it did not do, neither the private nor the public, for our public health. And the irony of ironies is, by losing 210,000 dead Americans, the failure of capitalism to prepare for this pandemic has cost more lives than the vast majority of wars this country has been in that didn't cost that many lives. It is an unspeakable expose of a system that is, in my judgment now, broken and probably beyond repair. One footnote. We teach in economics courses in America that capitalism is efficient. It's been a boast, a supposed virtue of capitalism that many have commented on. I only want to underscore one simple fact. The amount of money that would have been necessary to produce and stockpile masks, gloves, ventilators, hospital beds, and so forth for this pandemic is a tiny fraction of the amount of wealth we have now lost by having this economy broken down since March of this year, tens of millions of unemployed people, factories whose equipment is gathering rust and dust because it's not being used. Any notion that capitalism is efficient has just been erased right alongside any notion that a private capitalist system is the way to organize and deliver healthcare. It wasn't, it isn't now, and that's why every other industrial country handles their healthcare in a non-private capitalist dominated way. The only exception is the United States. That's done in deference to private capitalism, and it is now costing us literally hundreds of thousands of dead fellow Americans.
The cynic in me, Richard Wolff, says, okay, if we want to handle this the American way, then we should give responsibility for things like producing masks and ventilators to Lockheed and McConnell Douglas, and Boeing, allow them to charge 2,000% and limitless cost overruns. Maybe then the corporate capitalist system would be willing to embrace common sense. But obviously, that's not what you're proposing here. And again, for people listening, we're talking with Richard Wolff, author of the new book, The Sickness is the System. You address the obvious question that all of this raises in the book. And that question is, how would socialists have handled the pandemic better? You say, to answer, I need to distinguish between the three main kinds of socialism in the world today. And without going through them in detail, there's the one where the government takes a more active role in regulating the economy. There's the one that's often called communism, where the means of production themselves are owned by the government. And then there is the third, which is more of a decentralized democratization of the workplace. First of all, have I summarized that more or less correctly?
Beautifully. Absolutely. Yes, you have.
So,
That's
so go ahead.
well, I would
So,
say that here's an example, even though these are very different concepts of socialism, and that the first two are really more what we've had in the past, the 19th and 20th century. The focus of socialism on democratizing the workplace, I think that's where socialism is going now. I think that's going to be the major thematic of socialism in this century that we're still at the beginning of. But all three of them would handle this kind of a pandemic better than capitalism. Although that's not saying all that much, since to say it's better than US capitalism is a pretty low bar. I mean, let's be real honest. I am not endorsing the People's Republic of China nor their economic system. I'm not. But there's a fact here which Americans don't want to look at. I'll pick a date, 15th of August. So what is that? 6, 7 weeks ago, 8 weeks. Over the last 8 weeks, here's the reality. Tens of thousands of Americans have died of COVID. And over the last 7 weeks, there have been no cases of COVID in China. They had 2 people testing positive who were asymptomatic. I mean, we're talking about a People's Republic of China that has 4 times the population of the United States, but none of the disease. And they had the disease, as we all know. They were the first country to really get whacked by that disease. You know, it boggles the mind. And if you look at South Korea or Taiwan or New Zealand, in case people think I'm picking a country like China out of the hat, all of those countries have very, very low numbers. We have terribly high numbers. Okay, you've got to deal with what it is that went wrong. And now let me tell you something. The socialist systems of the past, the democratic socialisms of Scandinavia and Western Europe, where the government regulates a lot, or the more aggressive, let's call them, socialist societies like Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, where the government goes beyond regulation to literally take over and run the enterprises. In both of those kinds of, system, what you have is the ability of the government to mobilize resources, public resources and private resources, because the government is given a prominent, respected place in society, and it has for 100 years. So those governments are in a strong position to mobilize the people, the resources, the factories, the trains, the planes, to fight this virus. And that's what they did. And they've been pretty successful. And the same is true in China, Russia, Cuba, Vietnam, and so on. We can't do that in our country. In our country, the private sector has been so frightened of the prospect of a government that could have the strength to compete with the private sector, the strength to respond to the needs of the mass of the people, even when those needs contradict private capitalists. They've been so afraid of that that they've demonized the government. The government is to be kept without adequate resources. We are to hate paying taxes. We are to hate the government, not trust them, think they're living off the fat of the land, think they're the worst enemy. Our libertarian friends seem to think the beginning and end of evil is in the government. This is a society which, of course, cannot and will not let its government mobilize anything. The real reason we don't see the government stepping in to do in the public health interest what it does in the military interest is because the private sector, especially in the medical industrial complex, doctors, hospitals, drug and device makers, and the health insurance companies, they don't want the government anywhere near. They don't want the government to organize healthcare because they won't be able to maintain their monopoly. A little factoid that Americans know but don't want to face. We spend more for healthcare in the United States than any other advanced country. Roughly 18% of our total GDP, our total production of goods and services, goes into the healthcare. That's not because we produce more, it's because we charge more. It's a much more expensive healthcare system. But the outcome of our people isn't at all better than other countries. It's in fact kind of mediocre. Americans don't live as long as most people in Europe do. And they have for quite a while now. Their longevity is going up. Ours is going down. They spend fewer days per year per person in a medical clinic. They need fewer medications. Their health outcomes are better, but they spend a lot less on it. Now, if Americans saw something as important as healthcare, and the quality of what they were getting was mediocre, but the price was the highest anywhere, an alarm bell would go off. They would understand there's something terribly wrong. Well, I repeat these statistics all the time, but I only have a limited reach. This horrific pandemic is teaching the lesson, just as you put it, RJ, before. It's exposing that we pay a fortune for a medical care system, and we get the worst conceivable service. More people have died and gotten sick of COVID in this country than anywhere on earth. I mean, what in the world? How much more in the way of laying bare the failures of a system do we have to have before Americans conclude, okay, you've had your run, capitalism, but you're not working, except for the richest of the rich at the top. For the vast majority, you're busted, you're broken. And we need to move on to a system that will be more focused on doing for the mass of people what capitalism clearly cannot do.
So Richard Wolff, and again, the book is The Sickness is the System. I don't know if I've ever told you this. Many of my listeners know it, but before I returned to my left-wing roots, I actually worked in the health insurance industry. I was considered kind of data leading light, data analysis and that kind of thing. So as a result of that, I'm trying to now use that for good, if you will. I've always been to the left of, for example, my old boss, Bernie Sanders, who supports Medicare for all and has led the fight for that. But that's a financing process. It would be an enormous improvement, but you would still have for-profit physician practices, for-profit hospitals, big pharma, all of the above, and they would all be pushing in the wrong direction when it comes to giving people the care we need. So especially in healthcare, I've tended to lean towards the full state model, the one that says we all have the VA, basically, the Veterans Administration, one where doctors are employees, that sort of thing. But I'm intrigued by the three socialisms you describe in your book. I guess mine falls more in the second category. Bernie's proposal falls more in the first category. But you have this third category that keeps intriguing me in healthcare and elsewhere. And this is the one of, I think of it almost as a socialist economy of confederated worker-owned businesses where, and I'm trying to picture that in healthcare, and I think I can, but is that a model, first of all, you think can be adopted in healthcare? Secondly, do you have any thoughts on what that might look like if it can?
Sure. Let me tease you a little bit. I'm sure you know that over the last 10 to 20 years in the United States, a huge number of hospitals have been closed. We have shut down our hospital institutions. We have reduced the total number of beds per person, et cetera, et cetera. All of that was done with a notion of quote unquote efficiency. Some person looked and counted the number of days that the bed was occupied or unoccupied, and concluded that if it wasn't occupied, or if it wasn't occupied by a paying patient, well, then the hospital wasn't efficient and it was closed, or a wing of it was closed. This is a notion of efficiency that is usually and properly called bean counting, because what it does is not understand that part of what you want a hospital system to be is full of beds that are mostly not used, so that when you have catastrophes, accidents, floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, or viral pandemics, you won't be caught flat footed with only the normal capacity when you have the perfectly predictable abnormal need for a lot more. That doesn't take rocket science to figure that out. But if you're narrowly focused on profit calculations, that's what you do. Here's my idea, and I'll tease you with the following. Along the way, when the hospitals were closed, people who lived in the immediate vicinity of these hospitals protested, because what they were being told was, we're going to take a risk with you getting hurt. You're not going to have the hospital 3 blocks from your urban home. You're going to have to travel 2 miles through urban traffic if, God forbid, something happens to you in the way of an injury or an illness. And people protested. And when they protested, they were given these little efficiency calculations to explain why the governor or the mayor or the head of the hospital's corporation in their area had chosen to close the hospital. Okay, now I enter. I'm called by these people that are resisting. They want to know what kind of argument could be made to keep the hospital open. And I give them the following. You oughtn't to calculate the question of keeping a hospital open or not, maintaining a bedroom with 3 beds or 4 beds for hospital patients, both those you have now and those you have reason to believe may need those beds in the future. That ought to be decided democratically. It ought to be decided by all the people in a hospital. And you know something? Not just the people in the hospital, but the people in the community. Because it turns out having a sense that you have a hospital nearby and that it is there for you and it will be there for you no matter what emergency arises is something that all human beings need to be safe, to feel safe, to know that their children and their elderly have places ready and willing and nearby to help them. That's an important social value, or at least I think so. And I would like a democratic way of not only determining whether I'm right about it, whether people want that as a basic part of the standard of living. And I want to know that if the people want it, they're in a position to make the decisions about whether it's there or not. And for me, therefore, an adequate, a democratic health system has to be converted into what I call worker co-ops. And I have worked on that in regard to hospitals. Yes, a hospital in which the nurses, the doctors, the orderlies, the tech people, all of them, one person, one vote, to decide many of the basic decisions about that hospital, including whether it's open or shut. This is not an argument that someone with no skill is going to do heart surgery. Of course not. People with special skills will be the ones asked to do those kinds of tasks. But those are separate from the overall running of the enterprise. just like indeed most of the people running hospitals today are administrators who have no skill in any particular medical specialty. We allow them to run the institution, and we should allow the people democratically to run the institution. I don't think you'd see the hospitals have closed the way they did. I think you would see a much more well adjusted hospital that meets the needs of the community it serves, because it gives that community real power to participate in the decisions. So for me, I think that socialism of this worker co-op kind is going to be the dominant socialism of the 21st century, in part because it gives a better, deeper answer to the question, what would be a better system than the one obviously failing us now?
Richard Wolff, and again, the book is The Sickness is the System. And not to make this all about me, but as you were talking, I was thinking back to when I was in college and I was a nurse's aide at a hospital, and eventually got let go. And my evaluation said, Richard's very kind with the patients and talks with them a lot. They love him, but he's not very good at his actual job, which is, the changing of the sheets and all that, which fair criticism, except that I think the patients were giving me more than I was giving them. But I was just wondering, what would a democratically run hospital say? Would they say, well, maybe that's a useful thing too? In other words, maybe we don't have to just.
When my mother was very ill with cancer, it eventually killed her, but she spent a good bit of her last years in various hospitals and clinics. And I can tell you that for me as her son, for my sister as her daughter, for her going through the experience, the kindness, the warmth that either did come or didn't come from a nurse, from an orderly, from a doctor, made all the difference in the world. My mother would have been the first one. She told me this repeatedly, that the tone of voice, the glance, is as therapeutic in those situations as the chemical that she's taking in, or the chemotherapy she gets, or whatever else. And most patients will tell you, and most psychologists will confirm, that how your body fights disease is shaped by your mentality and your state of your state of mind, and that the line between the mind and the body has always been a fuzzy, porous boundary, to say the least. And I think people know that, and they would make the hospitals and clinics much more user-friendly by having them in charge and able to say, look, you're a wonderful surgeon, doctor, but you've got to learn a little bit of something else as well. Otherwise, your demeanor undercuts your expertise, etc. All of those things, I think, would be enormously enhanced if we democratized the clinic, the medical practice, the hospital, and made it something that all of the players. I mean, I've worked in a hospital too. The tension between the senior doctors and the junior doctors, between one specialty versus another, between all the doctors and the nurses, between the nurses and those under. In the hospitals where I worked, they were given different color scrubs. One wore green, one wore yellow, one wore blue, so that, God forbid, they wouldn't get in the same elevator. I mean, those kinds of tensions have no place. They do not enhance the medical process. They undercut it.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about, again, is a kind of egalitarianism and democracy in the workplace, even on such matters. And I'm sure you saw this too. I can't tell you how many times I saw nurses decline to follow a doctor's medication orders because it would have killed the patient, but they were not allowed to point that out, right? He was, it was 70 cc's instead of 0.7 cc's, and whatever it is. So there's so much more we can discuss.
I remember working in a hospital one summer. My father got me a job. I didn't get paid, but I was supposed to teach me about how a hospital worked and all that. And I remember the very first day, a doctor coming in to a patient's room where I was mopping up and telling the in some nasty tone, telling the nurse what to do. And as he turns and leaves the room, I catch her eye. I just happen to be looking at her at that moment, and she rolls her eyes, doesn't say a word, but letting me, who she didn't even know me, letting me know that she was enduring this arrogant doctor. And you could tell in a moment that whatever medical care needs, this kind of tension, dislike, uh, is not going to make it better.
Not to mention Richard Wolff, before I let you go, the patient I had in his 90s, who everybody said was a pain in the neck, always complaining. But when I talked to him, I found out that he had left Russia many years ago and had been a sailor during the Kronstadt uprising, part of the Russian revolutionary process. I mean, this guy was living history, as so many of them, those patients were. And so, not to mention the ways we can be enriched by them in a more humane system.
Right. And my
Unfortunately,
guess would
if you
be
have closing thoughts, I'd love to hear them before we go.
yes. The point of the book was to say, look, folks, let's learn. The sickness we have to deal with is not so much the COVID, terrible as it is, urgent as it is. The sickness is a system, the capitalist system. We are now in the third crash of this new century. This is an unstable system. It produces levels of inequality that are tearing us apart. It's time to be able to say, without fearing reproach, let's begin talk about the system. We should have been doing it for the last 50 years. The Cold War made it impossible. Okay, the Cold War is over. Let's ask the question, can we do better than capitalism? And let's discuss and debate what the answers to that question might be. A healthy society should not fear doing that. And a society as dysfunctional as ours now is better do it, or else we're all going to be taken down with this system.
Beautifully said. And I recommend the book. Again, the book is The Sickness is the System, the author, Richard Wolff. And as always, Rick Wolff, thank you for your great work and thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure, RJ, and thank you for having a program like this. And I look forward to our next time.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.